Our hearing will come to order. We are again discussing the constitutional amendment for a balanced budget and the need to get a hold of what Paul Tsongas 2 days ago called our debt addiction. I think that's the right phrase, because you do not get rid of an addiction without a little bit of pain, whether it's drugs or alcohol or what it may be. But the reality is also having that little bit of pain is infinitely better than continuing the addiction, and we have to get a hold of it. My schedule says that Governor Lamb is the first to testify, but I know that Paul Volcker has, is it okay to go ahead with Governor Lamb first, or? Well, why don't we, Paul Volcker, why don't we take you first? And I have invited Paul Volcker to testify, not that he is not as a proponent of the balanced budget amendment, but someone who has spoken about the problems that we face with the deficit, and has spoken eloquently and has contributed immensely. I think no one since Arthur Burns has contributed as much to the U.S. economy as Paul Volcker, and it is an honor to have you here, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those words, and thank you for your interest in this subject, because it is a very large subject for the country. As your remarks may suggest, I don't yield to anyone in my concern about this succession of deficits we've had and the buildup of debt by the federal government. I think we are putting a burden on future generations, but I think we're putting a burden on our own generation because of the circumstances in which this has arisen. I don't think we can look at this deficit problem in a vacuum. The difficulty with the deficit, which is very great in my opinion in the United States, is that it comes in a country and at a time when we're not doing very well in savings and investment, X the deficit. And when you have a low savings rate, as we do, and our savings rate has chronically been rather low compared to most of our competitors, and it's gotten lower in recent years rather than higher. It has descended from an already low level. And then you put a deficit on top of that. The meaning is that a rather small supply of savings is being eaten up by a government deficit. If that government deficit could be translated directly into some productive investment, you might say not so bad, but of course that has not been happening. There is nothing in the record that suggests federal investment for the future is rising. That's probably been squeezed as well with the appropriate restraints on spending. So we are diverting a limited amount of potential savings by individuals and businesses into government consumption. We have been trying to correct for that, maybe not deliberately, but through the workings of the marketplace by importing capital from abroad. And we import a great deal of capital from abroad. The only way we can import capital from abroad is to run a current account deficit, and we like to sometimes blame other countries for that, beginning with Japan. But the fact is we are reliant upon capital from Japan and elsewhere to make up the deficiency that arises from the combination of an insufficiency of savings and large and chronic budget deficits absorbing those savings. Net result is that our investment activity, again relative to our trading partners, has not been very high. I think you can look at that in the perspective of a relatively slow growth rate in the United States, certainly slower than earlier in the post-war period when we didn't have deficits and the savings rate was higher. At least we didn't have deficits of the size we have run them recently. Productivity trends may be changing currently. I hope they are for the better. But for 20 years or so, it's been only 1% a year or a little bit more. Productivity is importantly related to investment. Investment's related to savings and the deficit. And it is a chronically unsatisfactory situation. Now, having said that, and just a few remarks on the idea of a balanced budget amendment, there's nothing in what I said that makes a balanced budget imperative in any particular year. And indeed, you might argue in some countries, in particular circumstances, a deficit is not particularly harmful and might even be useful. And of course, there are cyclical circumstances in which a budget deficit might be relatively harmless and in fact play some constructive part in economic policy. But having said all that, as far ahead as I can see, given the nature of the American problems, I think there is no escaping the proposition that we have a problem in chronic deficits and deficits that have been too large on the average. So anything we can propose to reduce that possibility has to be looked at very closely. Whether or not I can argue economically and in some kind of sophisticated way that there are times when deficits are less evil than other times and may make some positive contribution, I think the idea of having some clear benchmark, some clear discipline that starts logically from the idea of zero makes a lot of sense. I have to tell you frankly, I would, if you could write on a blank piece of paper and have the result come about, I think the United States ought to run budget surpluses. But I don't think we're going to have a constitutional amendment or anything else that mandates budgetary surpluses. And the idea of reinforcing the idea that in general a balanced budget makes sense is something that I have great sympathy for. The practical question is how to proceed. I might say I've been somewhat encouraged by recent developments, encouraged by the fact that President Clinton put this question front and center in his own program in his election campaign, and after he got elected, he not only made it a priority, but we did pass a bill, and I would have written the bill somewhat differently, as everybody else would if they had their own option, but I think it is a significant step toward beginning to deal with the budget. We have actually done something. I think it is also obvious that we haven't done enough to produce a balanced budget or anything like it. There is a clear possibility, looking at current projections, current probabilities, even allowing for the uncertainties of the health care package, which I suppose could go either way, that we will begin running bigger deficits again toward the end of the decade, the end of the century, than what we are achieving currently and prospectively in the next year or two. Worse than that, I think there is some danger after some excitement about it last year, the year before, that people will get complacent as they see the deficit declining in the short run and lose a sense of urgency about dealing with it in the longer run. Now that brings me to the question of the balanced budget amendment. Despite all I've said so far in testifying on this issue, I suppose 5 or 6 times in the last 10 or 15 years, I could not bring myself to actually support the balanced budget amendment for a variety of reasons. The first thing that one kind of looks at against the background of whatever I have already said is that any of these amendments imply a certain rigidity, balanced budget every year, some in stricter terms than in other terms, and against not only the possibility but the certainty that particular circumstances will change, the appropriateness of balance or a surplus or a deficit in particular years can't be foreseen. There may be an undesirable loss of flexibility. The most obvious case is when you have a recession. Revenues decline, expenditures tend to go up. It's not necessarily inappropriate against a strong fiscal background to run a deficit for a year or two in those kinds of circumstances. There are other circumstances in which the idea of strict adherence to a balanced budget may be too rigid. Secondly, there's a problem of rather arbitrary definitions that are inevitably involved in budgetary matters in general and would become more difficult when you try to write a constitutional amendment. revolving around what's an expenditure, what's a tax. We see that right now in this evaluation by the Congressional Budget Office as to whether the proposals made to the health care plan are a tax and an expenditure by the federal government, or are they not. But conceptually, there's always a possibility of mandating somebody else to make the expenditure, relying upon regulations instead of expenditures, when the expenditure may be more effective actually programmatically than the mandate. All kinds of arbitrary elements enter in, and you can look backwards at budgetary history and see a good deal of use of gimmicks, to use the colloquial, in the past, and you would be feeding more effort in that direction in the future. More philosophically, I have not thought that trying to write into the Constitution an accounting convention is appropriate. Constitution is a document in all its majesty that deals with some fundamental rights and some fundamental procedures of democratic and constitutional government. Much as I am concerned about budget deficits, does it rise to that status? There is at least a question. Finally, and it's probably not appropriate in the context of your interest, Mr. Chairman, but I have wondered whether some of the feeling about attention to balanced budget amendment isn't a substitute for some people in the political process for doing something here and now. They could go and tell their constituencies that they're very worried about a budgetary balance because they're in favor of a balanced budget amendment, and meanwhile don't feel the same sense of concern about doing something here and now with very tough actions on the tax or expenditure side. Now, having said all that, let me say, with respect to your amendment, it seems to me the most sensible and workable of the various amendments that I've seen over this 15-year period in dealing with the constitutional problems and the budgetary problem, if you were going to have that kind of an amendment. It doesn't attempt to get into a lot of the bookkeeping details, and it simply says it increases the threshold of voting necessary to unbalance the budget. At least that's one way of looking at it. And isn't it reasonable under the circumstances to require a qualified vote of 60% of the House and the Senate to unbalance the budget? Well, my favorite proposal in this area bears some family resemblance to yours. If the problem is we're too apt to spend money in response to the various legitimate and other pressures that arise to do good, let's make it a little harder to spend money and have precisely the kind of 60% vote that you're proposing on an expenditure bill. I don't think it's a very good idea, and you have a fragment of that in your proposal for a majority vote of the whole House for a tax bill. I don't think our problem is the ease of passing tax bills. The problem is that we haven't been willing to pass the tax bills to match our spending proclivity, so why not put the emphasis on the spending side? I haven't gotten much of a following for that proposal when I have stated it before, but it still seems to me that it makes a certain amount of sense. It doesn't entirely escape the definitional problem, but would go a good way toward dealing with the rigidities and arbitrariness of the balanced budget amendment. When I look at your proposal, I've expressed my concern about the tax aspect. Let's not make it any more difficult than it already is to raise taxes when we have a deficit problem. If we had a surplus problem, I would have sympathy for that, but we don't have that. I don't particularly like the provision that requires a 60% vote for increasing the debt. I speak from experience as an old Treasury official here, when you were always fighting the debt ceiling legislation, when the commitment to spend the money had already been made. And the failure to raise the debt at that point only involves the risk of total dislocation of the governmental process, because you would draw the government to a close so far as spending any money is concerned if you can't issue the debt. And I'm afraid that the political pressures may cause people to vote for the expenditures and not vote for the taxes and end up with the deficit, and then they don't vote for the debt, and then you're in a mess. So if you're going to have this amendment, I would propose taking that particular provision out of it. But most of all, even in looking at your amendment, which I think comes as close as as I have seen to something that might make sense, I am left with the question of what do you do if there's an impasse? Suppose you can't get that 60% vote. And I could imagine circumstances in which that would be the case. There would be too much disagreement about the ingredients, either on the tax side or the expenditure side or both, that you can't marshal your 60% majority. And people would rather say, what happens in those circumstances? We'll wait and see and let things go on. Now, if that happens now, you have the device of continuing resolutions and the government goes on, and maybe you can argue that that's one of the reasons we have a problem. It's too easy to escape the issue. But your amendment doesn't answer for me the question of how you face up to the issue if you have the same kind of an impasse and on September 30th of the year 2001, or whatever your amendment takes effect, there is no 60% vote for anything. Do we close up the government? Do we turn it over to the courts? What kind of procedure does that imply? So I will stop and leaving you with that question and not being able to bring myself to the point where I really want to lend my support for whatever that's worth to the amendment.
No, but I have to say you have come closer than you have ever come before, and I appreciate that. Let me just respond very briefly to some of the questions that you raised. In terms of what happens if you don't get 60%, the reality is because of the cloture and filibuster rule in the Senate, 40% can block things in the Senate right now. And, you know, we have, sometimes we've struggled a little bit, but somehow democracy works. And we have done the responsible thing, sometimes a few days late, but we have ultimately done it.
Well, on the budget, sometimes, if I may interrupt you, it's not exactly, I won't use the words responsible or irresponsible, but you've gone for months and months without a budget.
Yes.
But you have a device that picks it up in a halfway orderly fashion.
Right.
What would be the device in this amendment?
Well, in fact, in an extension of the debt, there is no, you know, you can have a continuing resolution and
the
so
debt,
forth.
right, you have to act.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
On the 3/5 for extending the debt, this is so that there can't be gimmicks. Because, and you use the word gimmick, and Representative Olympia Snowe had a great line. She said, if this were a gimmick, Congress would have passed it a long time ago. The reality is we have to lock this in. We have to show it's serious. And you can't play off-budget, on-budget games. And that's why that is there. On the taxes, we did this compromise, and it is a compromise, as most of the Constitution was a compromise. As you may recall, there were proposals that you had to have a 3/5 vote to have an increase in taxes.
Well recall that.
And that would present, you know, almost insuperable barriers. And we finally worked out the compromise of the majority of those elected. And in this century, almost every tax that has been passed by a majority of those who have been elected. So it has not been that much of a problem. In the Federalist Papers, and this was not, Thomas Jefferson was one who favored, as you know, the idea of having, he advocated an absolute prohibition in the Constitution against borrowing. But the Federalist Papers, there's a phrase about the eagerness for spending should be matched by the reluctance to tax. We do not have that, and that's why this deficit is, and here is historically, this is what has happened. I don't know if you can see that graph from where you are right there. That's what's happened in our budgets and deficits. And with the projection by CBO, while we're down now, and you want to put up the Domenici chart there. This is this is CBO's projection right now. You can see where we're coming down for 94, 95.
Right.
And what we are suggesting in this amendment is that by the year 2001, so, well, and we would have a gradual decline there, so that it would be less precipitous than the current year, or FY 95. The question of how you deal with a recession, our mutual Fred Bergston testified day before yesterday. He suggested that we ought to aim for a 1% surplus. And then, if there is a recession, you can use that surplus to help cushion the recession. The difficulty right now is Bill Clinton suggested when he came in that we have a small stimulus and small $11 billion in a $6 trillion economy, but we are so strapped because of deficits and debts and everything that we couldn't pass the $11 billion. I voted for it. But you can set up procedures with a balanced budget amendment to deal with a recession. I'm concerned on a couple of questions, and this is what I'd be interested in asking you. As you looked at that, our debt addiction, we are right now about 17%, I think, dependent on foreign ownership of our bonds. That's the publicly acknowledged. Privately, it's probably higher, the total is probably higher than that. If you were the president of the First National Bank in Carbondale, Illinois, and I came to you and I said, I'd like to spend more money this year than I take in, will you lend me some money? And I had a good asset sheet, you would lend me some money probably. And if I came back a second year and a third year, you would do that. But after 25 years, a prudent banker might say, I'm going to have to put my money somewhere else. We don't know when that time comes, but it seems to me that there is the danger that at some point, if we continue this, that the international financial community is going to say there are safer places to put our money than the United States. Is that an unrealistic scenario I'm painting for you?
I don't think it's conceptually unrealistic, and it happens to countries, and it could happen to the United States. I think it involves a lot of variables other than the federal deficit itself. Again, as I said earlier, if we had a high rate of savings and we were very productive and the economy was growing rapidly, people wouldn't bother about a deficit of 2 or 3% of the GNP as they don't with many other countries. The kind of emergency that you are concerned about typically, I think, would not come about simply because of a succession of deficits, even within the magnitude that we are talking about. We're a big country. We can take those for a long time, unfortunately. It erodes economic performance, but it doesn't create an emergency. The problem would come if, for whatever reason, there were other questions arising about the solidity and stability of the United States and its future, which you can't discount. Our question of competitiveness internationally strikes one as among the most likely things that could happen in a perhaps unlikely scenario. Do our foreign deficits get so big and so prolonged, and they're related to the budget deficit, that at some point people say, why should I hold the dollar? It always depreciates. And you have an oil crisis, you have international political disturbance of some sort that reflects adversely on the United States. These are just hypothesizing. You could get some combination of circumstances in which the background of big government debt and big government deficits is not helpful. It contributes to the sense of lack of confidence and undercutting confidence and instability that would ensue in those circumstances. So I don't dismiss your concerns entirely, even though they are unpredictable and not on the immediate horizon, and not on the foreseeable horizon, particularly in a world when the rest of the world has so many problems.
Right, and I am not, so that I'm not, I don't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not suggesting that tomorrow we face
But prudently, you don't want to expose yourself to that over decades. That's
absolutely. One other area, the GAO in a report of June of '92, which obviously would have to be changed today, but they are projecting by the year 2020 a debt to GDP ratio of over 20%. Now that would drop some as a result of what we did this past year.
the debt to
GDP
of what percent?
20%.
Well, it's high, no, it's higher than 20. It's 60% or something today. 120% maybe.
No, but do we have that? What? The deficit to
deficit to GDP.
Yeah. Anyway, put up the OMB.
Then we'd have a real debt. Then we'd be talking about the kind of potential crisis that you were mentioning with 20% deficit.
And the question is, does any country that you know of have gone to that length and not monetize the debt?
Yeah, no, what your typical response is you have a lot of inflation. Precisely.
Yeah.
You monetize the debt, you create excessive amount of money, you have an inflationary process which of a sort that is totally inconsistent with any pretense of American leadership in the world, politically or economically or anything else, if that ever happened to us.
Now, this is from the GAO figures are a little outdated, as I indicated, because of what happened in last year. But here we have, this is from OMB, and they're part of these voluminous things that we just got the other day. Lifetime net tax rates under alternative policies. For example, I was born in 1930. I was born in 1928. But 1930, I'll end up paying about 30% of my lifetime net earnings in taxes. You go down here to future generations, and they say prior to the passage of reconciliation, it was 93%. After reconciliation, it's 82%. If we have health care, it will be 66 to 75% of the net lifetime earnings of future generations will go for taxation. Now, this is not Paul Simon's figures, not GAO, this is OMB. Is it likely, do you think, that we can ever get anywhere close to that without monetizing the debt?
Not with an effectively functioning economy, as even if you monetize that amount of debt, you wouldn't have an effectively functioning economy anyway. I don't know, I'm no expert in how they got those figures, but with a tax rate of 94%, to take the highest one there, you wouldn't have much business activity, I'm afraid, and any growth or anything else. You wouldn't have a functioning economy. And you would presumably try to inflate it away or responsibly do something about it. I don't want to depart from your line of thought, but looking at a calculation of that sort takes me back to a comment you made earlier about the reason for putting debt in here, that you can't get away from that with gimmicks. But I'm afraid you can get away with it whether it's a gimmick or not. Sometimes it's gimmicks and sometimes it's not. I presume you get a calculation of that sort because of the unfunded liabilities of the federal government looking ahead in Social Security and in other areas. And
Social Security and debt service are the big two items.
Yeah. So if you look at Social Security, that is a big future liability of the United States government, but it doesn't appear in the debt figures. They've taken account of it here, which is why it's so big. But there are a lot of ways you can push potential expenditures off into the future and create an obligation that doesn't happen to come within the definition of what we call a U.S. government obligation that's traded in the market, which is what your amendment applies to.
That is the point. And what we are doing, if I may brag, I'm going to become a grandfather twice this year. What we are doing is shifting this burden to those 2 grandchildren. Every other generation of Americans has taken care of themselves and invested in the future. We're the first generation of Americans to partially take care of ourselves and borrow from the future.
If I understand this correctly, we're punishing, in effect, the future generation 2 ways. Direct taxation and transfer payment, which that takes care of, and it's the interest payment and Social Security are the big items, as you suggest. We also detract from their ability of the future generations to pay 94% taxes, to take the ridiculous extreme, because we are not investing in the future and increasing their incomes the way our incomes increased along with the average American in our lifetime.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it seems to me that we are on a course toward monetization of the currency eventually. And I don't know of any obstacle that will stop this other than a constitutional amendment. I do not claim that you're not correct, that some people vote for it because it's a, you know, it sounds good, but they're unwilling to take the tough steps. I'm willing to take the tough steps. I think we have to force ourselves into a situation where, if nothing else, we give politicians cover for taking unpopular stands. Those of us in politics like to get reelected. Governor Lamb can appreciate this. We don't like to do unpopular things. And if we have a choice of doing something unpopular or ducking, we duck. And that's what we've been doing on the deficit. We've been ducking, and I think without a constitutional amendment, we will continue to duck. That's I think that is the issue. You have your finger on a very large problem and a large part of political reality. I think the idea of a constitutional amendment, I think yours is, as I say, the most sensible and straightforward in many ways of what I've seen. It's just not a disguised effort to make it even harder to raise taxes. I don't interpret it that way. Nonetheless, it brings with it, I think, inevitably some of the questions, in my mind anyway, that I've raised. And I understand, and I appreciate both your contribution to the nation over the years and your willingness to fly down here from Boston and be with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate being here.
I will take a 1-minute recess. I have a call from Senator Byrd. And our next witness, Governor Richard Lamb, who has been willing to say unconventional things and be very forthright in a whole number of fields, and was pleased when I called him. He was not only willing but eager to come here and testify. And Governor, we welcome you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to really testify as an opponent to the balanced budget amendment, but a reformed opponent. Because when this idea first came out, I didn't think it was a good idea, and I would like to sort of take you through the odyssey that I went through, because, and I suspect that you went through, because I think some of the arguments initially were compelling, but upon reflection and experience, it seems to me that the overwhelming evidence is on your side. And consequently, I'm here enthusiastically on your side. Let me go through, if I could, just simply the kind of arguments that are made, because I don't think that they're fatuous. They're serious arguments. Number one, why don't we just go ahead and balance the budget? Or said maybe in the vernacular, isn't this a stop me before I do something irresponsible or foolish? Yes, that's fine. I think that was an argument that perhaps had credibility in 1977 or 1980. But it seems to me that my generation, our generation, my generation has only balanced one budget in the last 33 years. I believe that no reasonable observer can honestly believe that actually business as usual is going to balance the budget. I really did take that argument seriously, but I no longer take it seriously. It seems to me that it's a victory of hope over reality to believe that we can rebalance our budget without some constitutional demand. Number two, argument isn't the cure worse than the disease? And I think nobody that's read economic history could really honestly say that. Debt creeps up on a society and on little cat's feet. One well-meaning program after another is added to the budget process. I've seen it in the state level. You certainly have seen it on a federal level. Well-intentioned people doing well-meaning things. But the net cumulative effect of it is to put such a burden of debt on the next generation as to simply make it intolerable. We hear that cuts in spending would cause somebody some pain, and I'm sure that that's true, as you just reflected. But that reasoning is a formula for massive political and fiscal turmoil in the future. Economies are destabilized by well-intentioned people who don't mean to do any particular harm, but the sad truth is we've simply invented a system without breaks. And I do not think the cure is worse than the disease when you really recognize that the status quo, what we see right now as a result of deficit spending, is not the disease. It is political and economic instability of the kind that you see in other economies throughout history that have allowed their debt to overrun themselves. Number three, it is said that debt isn't always bad. And of course, as Mr. Volker said, that's obviously true. I mean, there's times, I guess I'm a Keynesian like anybody else. My parents borrowed money to fight Hitler. My parents borrowed money to fight a depression. Perfectly fine. Nobody can blame them. But my generation, having balanced only one budget in the 33 years that I've been out, that's a record of irresponsibility that demands some new level of response. You can't just simply say that can go on forever. It is not borrowing money to invest. It is borrowing money to consume. And in my opinion, these are nation-threatening deficits. That red line that you had up there, I mean, that is not just simply the type of deficits that we ran in the 30s on a temporary basis. I'm a certified public accountant. I'm a certified public accountant by training. Let me go through that. I have been writing for the last 10 years about the costs of the future. It seems to me that there's the question about the $4.4 trillion deficit, but I'm much more interested in sort of the costs of the future. What are my children and your two new grandchildren going to have to pay off in terms of not any kind of abstract accounting item of $4.4 trillion, but what realistically are they going to have to reach into their pocket? And that's why I thought that that other chart that you brought up is very important. I look at unfunded liabilities. I look at contingent liabilities, which I think now almost all of my political experience say are probably going to come true. The unfunded liabilities, which would be military pensions, federal civil service pensions, Social Security, a number of things like that. Then there's the whole contingent liabilities, which once you go beyond a certain balance point in your society, I suspect that like this isn't my metaphor, but somebody else's, like a bunch of mountain climbers roped together, which normally help support themselves, but once in a while, the whole system brings all of the mountain climbers off of the mountain. I believe that when you look at the costs of the future and you look at how much our children and grandchildren are going to have to reach into their pocket, it's simply, it's already perhaps beyond a point of stability. We're going to have to monetize the debt, or we're going to have to experience a level of pain. But whatever it is, it's going to be better than letting it continue. I mean, the longer that this goes, the earlier, my rule of public policy is the earlier the solution, the less draconian the pain. Lastly is the idea that aren't we inviting an increased role of the judiciary? Well, yes, I think there is some risk about that. I think that, but it's small compared to what we happen if we don't do the status quo. In other words, one road, i.e. the balanced budget amendment, leads to some possible, maybe, intrusion by the judiciary if Congress and the President act irresponsibly and don't follow the new constitutional provision. But down this road, in my opinion, lies less economic growth, less jobs, less saving, in my opinion, it lies economic trauma if that chart is allowed to continue. Coming out of the White House right now here recently, I was Bill Clinton's Western coordinator. I appreciate him, but the argument that aren't we going to have to make some hard choices? Aren't we going to have to cut Social Security or make some other hard choices? Yes, of course. Congress is going to have to make some hard choices, but nowhere near as tough as the decisions that are going to have to be made by another generation or even just a few years down the road if we don't do this. No generation can borrow. You can't run up figures, in my opinion, of those size with no hope of ending it in sight with impunity. Ben Friedman and others, as you know, have written eloquently about this, talking about a day of reckoning, and I think a day of reckoning has come. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I mean, never has a generation so compromised the future of their children as my generation. I just can't believe, and just a takeoff of what you just said, is that for 10 generations, American mothers and fathers were able to leave a better economy to their children until our generation. And we have left I believe a Mount Everest of debt that will forever, we've consumed into what should be their lifestyle and their ability to run their own lives and programs. I do not believe that we can do politically what it is necessary to do to save us economically. I think bottom line, that's my analysis, and that's what sort of tipped me over, is in my experience in the political system, is we simply can't do politically what is necessary to save us economically without some sort of measure as the type that you do. We've invented, in other words, a system without brakes. We simply can't resist the temptation to borrow. We're a nation that knows what it wants, but not what it can afford. And we need a new discipline of the kind that you talk about. I have a poem for you to end with. Howard Nimmeroff was America's Poet Laureate. He died last year. And he says this. He said, "Praise without end the go-ahead zeal of whoever it was that invented the wheel, but never a word for the poor soul's sake who thought ahead and invented the brake." Bingo. It is very easy to invent a system that spins and has wheels, but it is very difficult to invent a system with brakes. But I think of no greater need for our generation to do than to develop some brakes.
I thank you, and that's as good an analogy as any I have heard. Let me just comment on one point and then ask a few questions. On judicial involvement, the amendment says Congress shall implement. and we can determine who has standing, so that we could say you have to have 25 members of Congress or something like that in order to go into court to have standing on this, so that there will not be this mountain of litigation out there constantly that people are talking about. I would add, while our record is not good, I think with a constitutional restraint, we're going to pay attention to the Constitution. The only oath I take is to uphold the Constitution, and I think it would be honored. In the state of Colorado, do you have, while you served as governor there, did you have constitutional restraints in your state constitution?
Yes. That's one thing I'd like to comment with regards to what Paul Volcker said. I mean, a constitution is a different document than just passing regular laws. It is the institutional framework that a bunch of our forefathers and foremothers thought about in terms of what do we need to run a sane state. But you have to admit, what is it, 47 or 48 of the states have put in a demand of a constitutional balanced budget. I would have been put in jail for any one of my 12 years that we would have been running a deficit. I mean, I think other constitutional bodies have seen the necessity, and I believe that the original one set up the U.S. Constitution saw it because what Jefferson is, they didn't put it in there, but they didn't think it was necessary.
But the critics say, well, the restraint on the states is really kind of meaningless. There are all kinds of ways they can get around it with capital budgets and other things that you don't really have restraints at the state level any more than we do at the federal level.
That's just plain not true. I do believe that creative politicians can, you know, if you allow them, can play all kinds of games. But I've really looked at this in some detail. In Colorado, we have practically no debt. We have no general obligation debt. You have a few states that have large amounts of debts. But most states take that constitutional demand very seriously and balance the budget. They use the balanced budget requirement as a backbone to say no to the endless demands on the system.
And when you say they take the constitutional demand seriously, I think the United States Congress would if we were to pass something like this. What about the political realities? There are people who say, if we have the courage to do it, we can do it now. We don't need a constitutional amendment. Of course, that was the argument in 1986 when we lost it by one vote. Yeah. We had a $2 trillion deficit. Now we have a $4.4 trillion deficit. But how would you respond to people who say, all we need is a little more courage. We don't need a constitutional amendment. A little more courage, and we can do it.
I mean, you can't deny the value of history and precedent. I mean, it seems to me that if it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked, and it's a problem that is bound to get worse, at some point you give an argument credulence until it's disproved by reality. And I think that the idea that this is going to happen by status quo or business as usual politics is against everything we know the last 33 years. It isn't only 1986, as you know. You go back to a whole pattern of spending where you seem to have, and by the way, I'm not at all sure that it's the kind of thing that it's only Congress's or only politicians' fault. In your state, Adlai Stevenson once said, government is a pump, and it pumps up in a political office a pretty fair reflection of what we are as a people. I do believe that one of the difficulties we're in is we are a nation that again knows what it wants but not what it can afford, and I think that they generally the political system tries to reflect that. Now I believe there is a new awareness on the danger of the deficits, that some discipline and restraint is necessary, and so I mean I really think that the time has come for your amendment.
Governor, we thank you very, very much. I appreciate your flying out here, flying out overnight to get here. We really appreciate it. Our next witness is Robert Myers, the former Deputy Commissioner for the Social Security Administration and the former Chief Actuary for the Social Security Administration. Very pleased to have you here, Mr. Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very
Pull that microphone just a little closer to you there.
Oops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity of expressing my support for the balanced budget amendment. As you know, I worked for the Social Security Administration for some 37 years. I'm very proud to have done so. I think it's been a very successful program, and I think it will continue to be so. And I will continue to do everything I can to assure that Social Security fulfills its promises and goals, not only next year and the year after, but for decades to come, long after I've passed away from this earth. I realize that at the present time and in recent years, there has been a considerable lack of public confidence in the long-range viability of the Social Security system, but I do not believe that this is really justified. Changes within the program can readily be made in the future to assure viability, and this can be done well in advance and planned so as to have a smooth transition and thus lessen the pain. Social Security has been fully self-supporting from the payroll taxes over the years, and I think it will continue to be so if the rest of the federal government acts with a fiscal prudence, as I think would result if your amendment to the Constitution were enacted. The fund balance of the Social Security system now is almost $400 billion. This is invested in government bonds that are part of the national debt and show up therein, and they bear an equitable interest rate. This fund has been built up by excesses of income over outgo in the past, not in every year, but in most years there was an excess of income over outgo, which some people incorrectly call surplus. Certainly from an accounting standpoint, it's not a surplus, it's just the excess of income over outgo. The operations of the trust funds would, under the amendment, be included in the computation of the budget deficit. Thus, it is easier for the requirement to be met, at least in the next 10 to 15 years, because it is virtually certain that Social Security will have an excess of income over outgo for that period of years. Thereafter, there may be some problems. These can be addressed, and a number of people are seriously considering what to do over the long range to bring the system into balance. But certainly, for some years to come, there will surely be annual excesses of income over outgo of $50 to $100 billion. Now, even though the federal budget is in balance if it's computed this way, I think it should be recognized that the national debt will still rise. The reasons for this is that any excess of income over outgo of the Social Security trust funds is invested in government bonds. If the Social Security system did not have these excesses, other people, the general public, would have to buy the bonds. So the excess of income over outgo of the Social Security system doesn't really reduce the national debt at all. The national debt is there just the same. If the Social Security system were not considered in the computations of the requirement to balance the budget, the fiscal restraints would have to be even stronger than they would be under the amendment the way it's written. Nonetheless, the proposal goes a long, long way towards restoring fiscal integrity. Now, I should point out that there is a smoke and mirrors sort of effect of considering budget balance in this way, and I'd like to give you two examples of this. In the recent OBRA of 1993, two changes were made that went toward meeting the so-called $496 billion of budget deficit reduction in the next five fiscal years. One of these was to increase the income taxes on Social Security benefits. But unlike other income taxes or increases in income taxes, the money didn't stay in the money will not stay in the general fund. Instead, rather anomalously, it will be given back to the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund. The Hospital Insurance Trust Fund then will buy government bonds with it that otherwise would have been bought by other people. And although the budget deficit is shown under this concept is shown as being reduced, it has no effect whatsoever on the national debt. The other example deals in a somewhat similar manner with removing the maximum taxable amount for the hospital insurance payroll taxes. I've just written a paper, it's just been published, on this subject, and it's entitled "The Role of Social Security in the Smoke and Mirrors Budget Deficit," and I'd request permission to include it in the record.
It will be included in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many people assert that the budget deficit reduction should be done by the Social Security system, at least in part, and I think there are three reasons why this should not be done. First of all, as I indicated, Social Security is a self-financed system, and if the excess of income over outgo is increased, this merely is used to purchase government obligations that people otherwise would have bought, so that it does not stop the national debt from rising if you decrease Social Security outgo. Second, Social Security, as I said, is a self-financed system. Over the years, its budget has been in balance, so why should it bear the burden of balancing the budget for other programs? And finally, since Social Security is self-financed, if its outgo is decreased permanently, say at the extreme you reduce benefits by 10%, then you should also reduce taxes by 10%, the tax rate that go to support the system by 10%, so that you're really back where you started from if you're looking at it to balance for these budget deficit calculations on this basis. Some people claim that if the balanced budget amendment were adopted, Social Security benefits would be reduced in one way or another in order to meet the requirements thereof. I think some of the people who oppose the amendment do so on this grounds that Social Security benefits will most certainly be cut because of the amendment. I agree that in theory this could occur. However, on grounds of integrity, logic, and fair play, I strongly doubt that it would ever be done or even seriously suggested. Certainly, the legislative history should indicate that there was no intention of so doing, that is, of reducing Social Security benefits to satisfy the requirements of this amendment. And in fact, I hope, and I believe that it would be desirable if a sense of the Senate resolution were adopted to this effect to bolster the legislative background that there's no intention of this amendment cutting Social Security benefits and being an indirect tool to do it. So in closing, Mr. Chairman, I certainly think that regaining control of our fiscal affairs is the most important step that we can take to protect the soundness of the Social Security system over the long-run future. I urge that the Congress adopt this amendment so that it can be considered by the states and be made part of our Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, Mr. Myers. How long were you chief actuary for Social Security?
From 1947 until 1970.
So 23 years.
Yes, sir.
You were chief actuary. How long were you deputy administrator?
2 years. And then I became the executive director of the National Commission on Social Security Reform, which was chaired by Mr. Volker's successor, Alan Greenspan, and which was a vivid example of how, in times of crisis, the country can get together, the Congress can get together, forget partisan conflicts, and get a good solution to the problem of preventing the Social Security system from going bankrupt, and at the same time spreading the pain of it, as it were, around more or less evenly.
And that is the commission in which former Congressman, the late Congressman Claude Pepper, took a very active role. Is that correct?
Yes, he was one of the many of the several active members from Congress. Senator Dole was, Senator Heinz, and on the House side, Barbara Conable and Bill Archer.
And you would say to seniors who are concerned about Social Security, who may be listening to our words right now, some people are advocating that they write in to be against the balanced budget amendment. You would tell them to write in support of the balanced budget amendment if they want to protect Social Security. Is that correct?
That is correct. Absolutely. I think that the system will be have a much greater likelihood of a long-range fiscal viability if the country gets the rest of its house in shape, as this amendment would certainly be a strong force to do so.
And the two dangers that I sense to the Social Security trust funds that we will face if we don't have this amendment, one will be that we'll just dip into the Social Security trust funds to take care of other needs. And the second is that we just start printing money. And of course that devastates the Social Security trust funds. Is that an inaccurate assessment of the perils?
No, I think that's accurate, Mr. Chairman. But I do want to emphasize that the fact that the trust funds have bought close to $400 billion of government bonds does not mean that the money was stolen or isn't there. These bonds are just as valid as the bonds that you or I might hold, or anybody in the general public. But there are the dangers, such as really happened in OBRA of 1993, that there will be indirect ways that there'll be the temptation to take the money out of the trust funds in some indirect manner by this manipulation of what you do with income taxes on benefits, and that you really don't leave them in the general treasury to balance the budget, but you in essence hand them back and that sort of thing.
And if we were to monetize the debt, those bonds become...
Yes, well, the worst thing, that even though Social Security benefits are indexed for inflation, if there was rampant inflation, I think you'd find that the beneficiaries would be much worse off. They might get huge increases in benefits, but they'd be getting them late, and they'd always sort of be behind the eight ball as far as that's concerned. And this is, I saw this last summer in the former Soviet Union, where there's been this great demonetization of the currency. The Social Security benefits have been increased somewhat to keep up with inflation. There are provisions to do that on an automatic basis, but they're always way behind the actual inflation. So that's the worst thing that really could happen to the beneficiaries if we don't get our national debt under control.
Mr. Myers, I thank you for your courage and for all you've done for Social Security through the years. We're very grateful to you, and we're grateful you're bringing your wife along with you here too today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.